There are moments in your life that announce themselves with thunder and lightning, moments you know will be etched into your memory like scars. But there are others, far more dangerous and far more beautiful, that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They come on a Tuesday night, smelling of rain and exhaustion, and they stand on your doorstep and ask a question so simple it could break your entire world in two. For me, that moment was Liam, framed in the soft, yellow light of my hallway, his shoulders slumped and his hair damp from the drizzle outside. He looked less like the force of nature I had always known him to be and more like a ship that had lost its anchor, drifting in a fog so thick he could no longer see the shore. He had just walked me home, a familiar ritual after our late-night talks that had become more frequent in recent weeks, but tonight felt different. The silence between us was heavier, filled with a substance I couldn't name but could feel pressing against my ribs. He lingered at the threshold, that liminal space between my world and the one outside, and I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he was not going to simply say goodnight. He looked at his feet, then back up at me, his eyes searching my face for something, permission, perhaps, or rejection. I held my breath, my own body a statue of anticipation. The air in the hallway seemed to thicken, each dust mote suspended in the warm light a tiny star in a galaxy of unspoken feeling. Then he spoke, his voice quiet, almost lost to the sound of a passing car. "Can I stay?" It was not a question about the weather, or the hour, or convenience. It was a question about sanctuary. He was asking to cross a line we had meticulously drawn around our friendship for years, a line I had guarded with the fierce, secret desperation of a man who knew he had too much to lose. To say yes was to admit that the line was an illusion. To say no was to reinforce it with brick and mortar, to potentially lose the very thing I was trying to protect. In that single, suspended moment, I saw the architecture of my life rearranging itself around his question. And I understood that my answer would not be a word, but a foundation upon which everything else would be built, or a door slamming shut forever. Our story didn't begin on a rain-slicked doorstep, of course. It began years earlier, in a place that smelled of chlorine and echoed with the rhythmic splash of water. We met on the university swim team, two bodies moving through the same element, but in entirely different ways. Liam was a sprinter. He was pure kinetic energy, a coiled spring of muscle and fire that exploded off the starting block. His races were a violent, beautiful spectacle of churning water and raw power, over in a flash of blinding white foam. He moved through the world in much the same way, with an easy, sun-drenched confidence that drew people into his orbit effortlessly. He was laughter in the locker room, a clap on the back after a hard set, the magnetic center of our team's gravity. I, on the other hand, was a distance swimmer. My work was not in the explosion, but in the enduring. I found my rhythm in the long, lonely black line at the bottom of the pool, in the metronomic repetition of breath and pull, breath and pull. My race was a quiet, internal battle against fatigue and the crushing weight of the water, a meditation that stretched on for lap after agonizing lap. I was the observer, the quiet one in the corner, more comfortable in the muffled silence beneath the surface than in the loud, boisterous air of the world Liam so easily commanded. It was an unlikely pairing, the sprinter and the distance man, the sun and the quiet depths. But our friendship was forged in the shared crucible of exhaustion. It was built in the early morning hours when the sky was still a bruised purple and the cold water shocked the sleep from our bones. It was solidified in the late afternoons when our muscles screamed and our bodies felt hollowed out, leaving only a raw, honest version of ourselves behind. We were both chasing something elusive in that water, a personal best, a sense of purpose and escape. We recognized the same quiet desperation in each other, even if our methods were different. After practice, we would sit on the cold tile of the locker room, too tired to speak, the silence between us more comfortable than any conversation. He would eventually break it with a deep sigh, running a hand through his wet, dark hair. "You're a machine, Eli," he'd say, a note of genuine awe in his voice. "I don't know how you do it. I would just shrug, offering a small smile. You just keep going. That was my philosophy for everything, really. In the pool and out of it. Especially when it came to him. My feelings for Liam didn't arrive in a sudden, crashing wave. They seeped in slowly, like waterlogged wood, until the truth of them was an undeniable weight inside me. At first, it was simple admiration. I was fascinated by his effortless grace, the way he could command a room with a single laugh, the fierce loyalty he showed his friends. I was a photographer even then, in an amateurish way, and I saw the world in compositions of light and shadow. Liam was pure light. I would watch him from across the pool deck, the fluorescent lights catching the beads of water on his shoulders, turning them into a constellation of tiny diamonds. I studied the way he moved, the economy of his power, the unself-conscious confidence in his own skin. He was a perfect subject, a study in living art. But observation, for me, has always been a dangerous pathway to affection. To truly see someone, to notice the small things, the way their eyes crinkle at the corners when they genuinely smile, the slight furrow in their brow when they're concentrating, the specific cadence of their breathing when they're tired, is to begin to care for them. And I saw everything. I saw the flicker of insecurity that sometimes crossed his face before a big race. I saw the quiet melancholy that settled over him when he thought no one was looking. I saw the profound kindness in the way he would stay late to help a freshman with their form, long after everyone else had gone home. I was collecting these small, unnoticed moments and storing them away like precious negatives, developing them in the darkroom of my own mind until they formed a portrait of someone I was quietly, irrevocably falling in love with. I built a fortress around this knowledge. Our friendship was too important, too vital. It was a rare point of stability in the chaotic world of university life. He had a girlfriend, Sarah, a kind and intelligent woman who was as bright and sunny as he was. They were a perfect match, the kind of couple that made sense to everyone. I became a fixture in their lives, the quiet, dependable friend. I was the third wheel on movie nights, the designated sober driver, the patient listener for both of their problems. I played my part so well that I almost convinced myself it was the only role I wanted. I learned to compartmentalize. There was Liam, my best friend, the person I could talk to about anything, the one who understood the silent language of shared exhaustion. And then there was the other Liam, the one who lived in the quiet, shuttered rooms of my heart, the one I yearned for with a dull, persistent ache that became the background noise of my life. I told myself it was enough. Having him in my life as a friend was infinitely better than not having him at all. And for years it was. After we graduated, our lives diverged, but our friendship remained a constant. Liam, with his sharp, logical mind, went into software engineering, a world of clean code and elegant solutions. I pursued photography, a world of messy chemicals, patient waiting, and the chaotic attempt to capture a sliver of truth in a frame of light. He moved into a sleek, modern apartment downtown, and I found a small, older place with good natural light and enough space for a makeshift darkroom. We saw each other less frequently, but the connection remained. Our conversations shifted from swim times and final exams to career anxieties and the bewildering reality of adult life. He was still my anchor, and I hoped, was still his. He was still with Sarah, and their relationship seemed to be on the steady, predictable track toward marriage. I accepted this as fact, a permanent feature of the landscape. The ache of my feelings for him had softened over time, settling into a familiar, manageable melancholy, like a chronic but low-grade fever. I had learned to live with it. I had to. The shift began subtly. It wasn't a sudden fracture, but the slow, grinding erosion of something that had once seemed indestructible. Liam started talking about Sarah differently. The easy affection in his voice was replaced by a kind of weary fondness. He spoke of their future together not with excitement, but with a sense of inevitability, as if it were a train he was on that had already passed his stop. He started seeking out my company more, suggesting we grab a beer or just hang out at my place after work. Our conversations grew longer, circling around vague feelings of restlessness and dissatisfaction he couldn't quite articulate. He felt like he was following a script that someone else had written for him. "Is this it?" he asked me one night, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You get the degree, you get the job, you get the girl. You just check all the boxes, and that's it." I didn't have an answer for him. I was still trying to figure out how to build a life outside of any boxes at all. All I could do was listen, and in listening, I provided a space where he didn't have to pretend. The breakup, when it finally happened, was quiet and sad, a mutual acknowledgement that they had been growing in different directions for a long time. There was no shouting, no drama, just the painful, methodical untangling of two lives that had been woven together for years. Liam was devastated, but not in the way I would have expected. It wasn't the sharp, passionate grief of a lost love, but the hollow, disorienting grief of a lost future. He hadn't just lost Sarah. He had lost the map he had been following for his entire adult life. He was adrift, and he was profoundly lonely. And that's when he started showing up at my apartment. At first, it was under the guise of needing a distraction. He'd bring over takeout, and we'd watch a movie, the familiar comfort of our friendship a balm against the raw emptiness of his new reality. He talked about the breakup in fits and starts, not looking for advice, just needing to voice the confusion, to give it shape in the air between us. I just listened, my quiet presence a container for his quiet pain. I was careful to keep a small, safe distance, both physically and emotionally. I was terrified of him misinterpreting my comfort as something predatory, of him thinking I was taking advantage of his vulnerability. My long-buried feelings were stirring again, waking from their dormant state, and I had to fight to keep them hidden, to keep our friendship pure and safe for him. It was a delicate, agonizing dance. Then came the first night he fell asleep on my couch. We had been watching some old black and white film, the kind I loved, and he usually only tolerated. He had been quiet all evening, his gaze distant. I was talking about something, the cinematography, I think, when I noticed the sound of his breathing had changed, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He was curled on his side, his head propped awkwardly against the armrest, his face softened and unguarded in the flickering light from the television. My heart did a slow, painful somersault in my chest. He looked so young, so vulnerable. A powerful, instinctual wave of protectiveness washed over me. I wanted to smooth the hair back from his forehead, to adjust the cushion under his head, to pull the throw blanket from the back of the chair and cover him with it. I did none of those things. I simply sat there for a long time, watching him breathe, the sound of fragile anchor in the quiet room. The boundary between us, the one I had so carefully maintained, felt porous, permeable. He was asleep in my home, in my space, trusting me on a level that felt new and profound. It was an intimacy by proxy, and it was almost more than I could bear. Eventually, I stood up on legs that felt unsteady, turned off the television, and left him there. I went to my own room and lay in the dark, listening for the sound of him stirring, my mind a chaotic whirl of hope and fear. This was dangerous territory. This was the beginning of something, or it was just a sad, lonely man falling asleep on his friend's couch. I had no way of knowing which, and the ambiguity was a unique form of torture. It became a ritual. It didn't happen every time he came over, but it happened often enough to become a new, unspoken part of our routine. He would never announce his intention to stay. He would just succumb to a wave of exhaustion in the late hours of the evening, his eyelids growing heavy, his words slurring slightly. "God, I'm so tired," he would murmur, and then his head would tip back against the cushions, and he would be gone. He never acknowledged it the next morning. He would wake up stiff and disoriented, run a hand through his messy hair, and accept the cup of coffee I offered him with a grateful, bleary-eyed smile. "Thanks, Eli," he'd say, and then he would leave for work, and we wouldn't speak of it. It was our secret, even from each other. A thing that happened, but was never discussed. Plausible deniability. He was just tired. My couch was just comfortable. It was just easier than driving home. For me, however, these nights were anything but simple. They were long, complex studies in restraint. Every nerve in my body was attuned to his presence in the other room. I became an expert in the geography of his sleep. I knew the specific cadence of his breathing as he slipped from light to deep slumber. I knew the small, guttural sound he made in the back of his throat when he was dreaming. I knew the way he would shift and sigh, burrowing deeper into the cushions as the temperature in the apartment dropped into pre-dawn hours. My apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, felt fundamentally different with him in it. It felt occupied. It felt like a home in a way it never had before. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for so long would recede, pushed back by the simple, profound fact of his breathing in the next room. One night, a cold snap had hit the city unexpectedly. I found him shivering in his sleep on the couch, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. He had only been wearing a t-shirt, and the thin throw blanket I had started leaving out for him was clearly not enough. My heart ached for him. Without thinking, I went to my linen closet and pulled out my thickest quilt, the heavy down one I saved for the coldest nights of winter. I walked back into the living room, my footsteps silent on the old wooden floor. The room was dark, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the window, casting a silver glow over his sleeping form. I stood over him for a moment, the quilt in my arms, and my resolve wavered. This felt like a transgression. This was an act of explicit care, harder to dismiss than simply leaving a blanket on a chair. But he shivered again, a full-body tremor, and my hesitation vanished. I gently unfolded the quilt and draped it over him. As I tucked it around his shoulders, my fingers brushed against the warm skin of his neck. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. His skin was so soft. He stirred at my touch, a low murmur escaping his lips, and his eyes fluttered open for a second. They were unfocused, clouded with sleep. "Eli," he mumbled, his voice thick and gravelly. My heart stopped. I was caught. "It's okay," I whispered, my own voice barely audible. "You were cold. Go back to sleep." He didn't seem to register my words. Instead, his hand came up, and, in a moment of sleep-dazed instinct, his fingers closed around my wrist. His grip was loose, but it was definite. He was holding on to me. "Stay," he breathed, the word a puff of warm air against my skin. And I did. I couldn't have moved if the building were on fire. I slowly, carefully, sank to my knees on the floor beside the couch, my wrist still captured in his hand. His eyes had already drifted shut again, his breathing deepening back into the rhythm of sleep. But he didn't let go. His fingers remained curled around my wrist, a fragile, unconscious tether between us. So I stayed there, kneeling in the moonlight, my body aching with the awkwardness of the position and my heart aching with a feeling so vast and overwhelming I thought it might shatter my ribs. I watched the rise and fall of his chest beneath the heavy quilt. I focused on the feeling of his thumb stroking absently against my pulse point. Was he aware of what he was doing? Was this some deep, subconscious confession? Or was it just the meaningless reflex of a sleeping man seeking warmth and comfort? I stayed there for what felt like hours, a silent sentinel, until my knees were screaming in protest and the first pale, gray light of dawn began to creep into the room. Only then, when his grip finally slackened in the deepest part of his sleep, did I gently pull my hand free and retreat to my own cold bed, the phantom touch of his fingers still burning on my skin. The ritual continued, but something had shifted after that night. The air between us was now charged with a new level of tension, a new awareness. He never mentioned the quilt or holding my hand, but I saw a change in his eyes when he looked at me. There was a new watchfulness, a flicker of something I couldn't decipher, confusion, maybe, or curiosity. He started seeking more physical contact, but always in ways that could be dismissed as casual. A hand lingering on my shoulder for a second too long. His knee brushing against mine when we sat on the couch. Small, insignificant touches that sent shockwaves through my system. I was a landscape under constant seismic stress, always waiting for the earthquake that would tear everything apart. I felt like I was developing a photograph in my mind, the image of what we could be slowly emerging from the chemical bath of our interactions. But the process was agonizingly slow, and I was terrified that one wrong move, 1 ounce too much of hope, would overexpose the print and leave me with nothing but a black, ruined sheet of paper. My entire life began to revolve around these nights. I would come home from a long day of shooting or working in the darkroom, and the first thing I would feel was a pang of anticipatory hope. Would he come over tonight? The thought was both a comfort and a torment. I started making sure my apartment was clean, that there was food in the fridge he liked, that the throw blanket was neatly folded on the chair. I realized with a jolt of self-awareness, nesting. I was building a comfortable, welcoming space for him, a sanctuary from his own empty apartment and his own confused heart. And he kept seeking it out. He kept returning to my quiet living room, to the worn cushions of my old couch, seeking a peace he couldn't seem to find anywhere else. I was his harbor, and he was my beautiful, heartbreakingly oblivious ship, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep guiding him to a safe port without admitting that I wanted him to drop anchor and stay forever. This brings us back to the rain-slicked doorstep. He hadn't fallen asleep on the couch that night. We had been at a mutual friend's birthday party, and the noise in the crowds had clearly drained him. He was quiet on the walk home, lost in his own thoughts. When we reached my building, the usual endpoint of our journey, he just stopped. He didn't make a move to say goodnight and head back to his own place. He just stood there, letting the fine mist of rain settle on his hair and jacket, looking at my front door as if it were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. And when he finally looked at me, his eyes were filled with a raw, undisguised need that stole the air from my lungs. It was a look that bypassed all our unspoken rules, all the plausible deniability. It was a look of pure, unadulterated loneliness. And then he asked the question that would change everything. Can I stay? I searched his face, looking for the usual excuses. He wasn't drunk. He didn't look particularly tired. This wasn't the slow, creeping exhaustion that usually led to him sleeping on my couch. This was something else. This was a conscious choice, a deliberate request. He was asking to cross the threshold, not just of my apartment, but of the carefully constructed friendship we had lived inside for so long. My mind raced, a frantic catalog of all the risks. If I said yes, the ambiguity would be gone. The ritual of the couch, with its built-in safety net of deniability, would be over. This was a new territory, a landscape with no map. But if I said no, I would be turning away the one person I had ever truly wanted to let in. I would be prioritizing my own fear over his pain. And I couldn't do that. I had spent years observing, waiting, protecting this fragile thing between us. Maybe it was time to see if it was strong enough to survive the truth. I stepped back, pulling the door open wider. It was the only answer I could give. Of course, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a long time, and a flicker of profound relief washed over his features. He stepped inside, out of the rain, and I closed the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place was deafeningly final. We were in. There was no going back. He stood awkwardly in my small entryway, dripping onto the mat. I took his wet jacket and hung it on a hook, the fabric cold and damp beneath my fingers. The silence was thick with everything we weren't saying. The question hung in the air. Where? The couch was the established territory, the safe zone. But his question hadn't been about the couch. I knew it. He knew it. I turned to face him, my heart hammering against my ribs. You can take my bed, I offered, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. I can take the couch. It was a compromise, a last-ditch effort to maintain some semblance of our old dynamic. He shook his head, a small, definite motion. He didn't look at me, but at the floor. No, he said quietly. That's not. I don't want to kick you out of your own bed. He finally lifted his gaze to mine, and his eyes were dark with a vulnerability that mirrored my own. I don't want to be alone tonight, Eli. There it was. The truth, stripped bare of all pretense. It wasn't about comfort or convenience. It was about loneliness. It was about seeking human warmth against the cold emptiness of a solitary life. He was asking for something I had been desperate to give him for years. And in that moment, the fear that had been my constant companion simply dissolved. It was replaced by a quiet, profound sense of clarity. I nodded, unable to speak. I led him down the short hallway to my bedroom. The room was simple, almost monastic. A bed, a dresser, a window looking out onto the quiet street. My camera equipment was neatly stored in one corner. It was my most private space, a room that had only ever been occupied by me. Having him in it felt both sacrilegious and perfectly right. I gave him a clean t-shirt and a pair of old sweatpants to sleep in, then left to give him a moment to change, my own movements feeling robotic and disconnected from my racing mind. When I returned, he was already in the bed, on the side furthest from the door, his back to me. He was just a shape under the covers, a still, silent presence in the dark. I walked around to the other side and slid under the covers, my body rigid with tension. The bed, which had always felt large and empty, now felt impossibly small. The space between us was a chasm, a high-voltage wire of awareness. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I could hear the almost imperceptible sound of his breathing. We lay there in the darkness for a long time, two separate islands in the same sea, the silence stretching on, thin and taut. I was certain I would not sleep. My mind was a riot of sensation and fear, and a hope so fierce it was painful. This was it, the point of no return. I had let him in. Then, from across the chasm, his voice came, a low whisper in the dark. "Eli." "Yeah." I whispered back, my throat tight. He rolled over to face me. I couldn't see his expression in the darkness, only the vague outline of his face, but I could feel his gaze on me. "Thank you," he said, and the simple gratitude in his voice was so profound, so laden with unspoken emotion, that it broke something open inside me. "You don't have to thank me," I said softly. "Ever." He was silent for another moment, and then I felt a hesitant movement. His hand moved across the space between us, and his fingers found mine. He didn't grab my hand, just gently laid his over it, his palm warm against the back of my knuckles. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not yet. It was a gesture of connection, of reassurance. An anchor in the dark. I turned my hand over and curled my fingers around his, accepting the offering. And we lay there, holding hands in the quiet darkness, until the rhythm of his breathing finally deepened into sleep. And I lay awake for hours, holding on to him, feeling like I had finally, after a lifetime of swimming, reached the shore. The morning after was a study in excruciating tenderness and awkwardness. The sun streamed in through the window, making the intimacy of the night before feel stark and exposed in the light of day. I woke first, my hand still loosely entwined with his. He was facing me, his face relaxed in sleep, his dark lashes resting against his skin. I allowed myself a single, stolen moment to just look at him, to memorize the peaceful set of his features, the way a stray lock of hair fell across his forehead. This was a sight I had only ever allowed myself to conjure in my most private dreams. To see it in reality was a shock to the system, a beautiful, terrifying gift. I gently extracted my hand from his and slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. I moved through my apartment with a sense of unreality, as if I were a ghost in my own life. The air was different. Everything was different. When he finally emerged from the bedroom, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and wearing my old, faded t-shirt, he looked lost. The vulnerability of the previous night was gone, replaced by a guarded confusion. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I offered him coffee, our usual morning after ritual, but this time it felt forced, a desperate attempt to pretend that nothing had changed, when we both knew that everything had. He accepted it with a mumbled thanks and drank it standing by the kitchen counter, his posture tense and defensive. The easy comfort that had always defined our friendship had evaporated, leaving a strained, brittle silence in its place. "I should get going," he said abruptly, placing the half-empty mug in the sink. He didn't look at me. "Liam," I started, but I didn't know what to say. What were the words for what had happened between us? There were no words. He just shook his head, a quick, dismissive gesture. "I'll see you later, Eli," and then he was gone, grabbing his jacket and leaving my apartment without a backward glance. The click of the door closing behind him this time was not final. It was hollow. It was the sound of an escape. I stood alone in my kitchen, the warmth from his coffee mug still radiating on the counter, and a cold, sickening dread washed over me. I had misread everything. I had taken his desperation for affection, his loneliness for a confession. I had opened the door, and in doing so, I had terrified him and shattered the most important relationship in my life. The quiet peace of the night before curdled into the bitter taste of regret. The days that followed were some of the worst of my life. A profound and deafening silence descended. Liam didn't call. He didn't text. My messages to him, casual and carefully worded attempts to check in, went unanswered, sitting in my phone with the brutal, single checkmark of delivery, but not of acknowledgement. He was avoiding me. He was erasing me. The ritual was broken. The sanctuary I had offered now a place of contamination in his mind. The ache of his absence was a physical presence in my apartment. The couch looked empty and accusing. The bedroom felt cavernous and cold. I had been lonely before, but this was a new dimension of the feeling. It was the loneliness of having been given a glimpse of a promised land, only to have the gates slammed shut in your face. I tortured myself by replaying every moment, every touch, every whispered word, searching for the point where I had gone wrong. I analyzed the memory of his hand in mine, trying to decide if it had been a plea for connection or a simple, thoughtless act of a man half asleep. I was a detective investigating the scene of a crime, and the victim was my own heart. The hope that had bloomed so fiercely in the darkness of my bedroom withered under the harsh, silent glare of the following days. I concluded, with a grim certainty, that I had projected my own years of yearning onto him. He had come to me for friendship, for a safe harbor, and in my selfish desire for more, I had turned it into something threatening. The shame was a heavy cloak I couldn't shrug off. After a week of this agonizing silence, I knew I couldn't let it stand. The ambiguity was killing me. I would rather have a clean, painful break than this slow, torturous fade to black. I needed to know. I needed to hear it from him, even if the words were the ones I dreaded most. I needed him to tell me I had ruined everything, so that I could at least begin the long, impossible process of trying to piece it back together or to mourn its loss properly. So, with my heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs, I walked to his apartment. The journey across town felt like a pilgrimage to a place of execution. Every step was heavy with the weight of my impending heartbreak. When I stood outside his door, the sleek, impersonal wood felt like a formidable barrier. I almost turned back a dozen times. But the thought of returning to my silent apartment, to the endless waiting, was worse. I took a deep breath and knocked. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway. I waited. For a long moment, there was nothing. I was about to knock again, my hopes sinking, when I heard the sound of the deadbolt turning. The door opened a few inches, and he was there, looking terrible. He was unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes. He was still in his pajamas, even though it was late afternoon. He looked at me, and his expression was a complicated storm of guilt, fear, and a deep, soul-crushing sadness. "Eli," he said, his voice rough. "Can I come in?" I asked, my own voice surprisingly calm. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped back, opening the door for me. His apartment was a reflection of his own inner chaos. Clothes were strewn over chairs. Takeout containers littered the coffee table. It was the apartment of a man who was falling apart. He didn't offer me a seat. He just stood in the middle of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. The silence between us was no longer brittle. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with a week's worth of unspoken fear and misunderstanding. I decided I had to be the one to break it. I couldn't bear the weight of it any longer. "Talk to me, Liam," I said, my voice soft but firm. "Please, just tell me what happened. What you're thinking." He wouldn't look at me. He stared at a point on the wall just over my shoulder. "I'm sorry, Eli," he mumbled. "I shouldn't have that night. I shouldn't have put you in that position." "What position?" I pressed, needing to understand. "What do you think that night was?" He finally met my gaze, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "I was a mess," he said, his voice cracking. "I was lonely, and I was selfish, and I used you. I used your kindness. And I freaked out. I woke up the next morning, and I felt like I had crossed a line, like I had taken advantage of our friendship, and I was so scared that I had made you uncomfortable, that I had ruined everything. His words were a torrent, a confession of his own fear and guilt. And in them, I heard not the rejection I had been dreading, but a mirror of my own anxieties. He wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of himself. He was afraid of what he had felt. "You didn't make me uncomfortable, Liam," I said, taking a step closer to him. My fear was gone, replaced by an urgent need to make him see. "Is that what you think? That I didn't want you there?" "I don't know what to think," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure distress. "Everything is so confusing. After Sarah, I felt so lost. And being with you, at your place, it was the only time I felt safe, calm. And that night, I just needed to be near you. I needed it like I needed to breathe. And that scared the hell out of me, because it didn't feel like just friendship anymore. And I didn't know what to do with that feeling. I still don't." He was laying it all bare. His confusion, his fear, his dawning realization. He wasn't rejecting me. He was admitting that he felt it too. The hope I had thought was dead and buried began to stir again. A tiny, fragile green shoot pushing its way through the wreckage of the past week. I closed the remaining distance between us until I was standing directly in front of him. I could see the frantic pulse beating in his throat. "Liam," I said, my voice barely more than a breath. "Look at me." He slowly lifted his head, his tear-filled eyes locking with mine. "You don't have to be confused," I said softly. "It's okay. Whatever you're feeling, it's okay." And then, I did the bravest thing I have ever done in my life. I reached up and gently cupped his face in my hands, my thumbs stroking over the rough stubble on his cheeks. He flinched at my touch, a small, involuntary recoil, but he didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, leaning into my hands as if he were a weary traveler finally reaching his destination. A single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. I wiped it away with my thumb. "Would it be okay?" I whispered, the words hanging in the still air of the messy room. "If I kissed you?" His eyes fluttered open, wide and searching. He stared at me for a long, heart-stopping moment, and in his gaze, I saw the last of his fear finally give way to a dawning, wondrous acceptance. He didn't speak. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and I leaned in and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of quiet reverence. It was soft and tentative, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of salt and coffee and a week of unspoken anguish. It was the gentlest of collisions, a final, definitive crossing of a line that had felt insurmountable just moments before. When I pulled back, we rested our foreheads together, both of us breathing heavily, as if we had just surfaced after being underwater for a very long time. "Oh," he breathed, a sound of pure, unadulterated revelation. "So that's what that was." A small, watery laugh escaped me. "Yeah," I whispered. "That's what that was." We didn't talk much more after that. There would be time for words later, time to navigate the new and beautiful landscape we had just discovered together. For now, what we needed was the simple, profound comfort of presence. I led him to his couch, and we sat down amidst the clutter of his life. He leaned his head on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around him, pulling him close. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, and his whole body seemed to relax against mine, the tension of the past week finally draining away. We sat like that for a long time, in the fading afternoon light, the silence no longer heavy or strained, but filled with a quiet, peaceful sense of beginning. He had walked me home that night, and in doing so, we had both, finally, found our way. The days and weeks that followed were a process of gentle excavation, of learning a new language together. The grand, dramatic confession was followed by a series of small, quiet revelations. We began to build our new normal not with grand gestures, but with the mundane, beautiful bricks of everyday life. It started with him cleaning his apartment, an act that felt symbolic, a clearing away of the old chaos to make room for something new. I helped him, and we moved in a comfortable, domestic silence, folding laundry and washing dishes, creating order together. That night, I didn't go back to my own apartment. I stayed, and when we went to bed, there was no chasm between us. He turned to me in the dark and pulled me against his chest, burying his face in my neck, and we fell asleep tangled together, two halves of a whole that had finally found their fit. Our relationship unfolded in these quiet moments. It was in the way he started leaving a toothbrush at my place, a silent declaration of his intention to return. It was in the way I started keeping his favorite kind of coffee in my cupboard. It was in the comfortable, easy way we learned to share a space, our bodies creating a familiar choreography as we moved around my small kitchen in the morning. The intense, analytical part of my brain, the part that had spent years dissecting his every word and gesture, finally went quiet. I no longer had to search for hidden meanings, because the truth was right there, in the warmth of his hand in mine as we walked down the street, in the easy smile he gave me over the top of his laptop when he was working from my couch, in the soft, sleepy way he would say my name in the middle of the night. The couch, once the stage for our ambiguous ritual of longing and denial, became just a piece of furniture again. One evening, a few weeks in, we were watching a movie and he started to doze off, his head nodding against my shoulder. I felt a pang of something, a memory of the old ache, the sweet torture of those nights. I looked down at him, his face peaceful in the glow of the screen, and I smiled. I gently shook his shoulder. "Hey," I whispered. "Come on. Let's go to bed." He blinked his eyes open, looking at me with a soft, sleep-dazed affection. "Okay," he mumbled, and he let me lead him, stumbling and pliant, to the bedroom. There was no pretext, no confusion, just the simple, profound fact of us going to bed together. The door to my bedroom, once a symbol of the ultimate boundary, was now just a door to our room. We learned to talk. Liam, who had always expressed himself through action, started to find the words for the feelings he had never known how to name. He told me how my quiet strength had always been a source of stability for him, even when he didn't realize it. He told me that what he had felt for Sarah was a comfortable, familiar love, but what he was feeling for me was something else entirely, something that felt like coming home to a place he hadn't known he was searching for. And I, in turn, learned to voice the love I had kept locked away for so long. I told him about the years of quiet observation, of the ache in my chest when I watched him from across the pool. I confessed my terror of risking our friendship. And with every confession, the foundation between us grew stronger, built on the bedrock of honesty and shared vulnerability. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. A friend, standing on your doorstep in the rain. A simple question. A choice to open a door. You don't know, in that moment, that you are standing on a threshold between the life you have known and the life that is waiting for you. You don't know that the quietest decisions can have the loudest, most beautiful repercussions. Looking back, I see that our whole story was a series of doors. The door to the pool, the door to my apartment, the door to my bedroom, the door to his guarded heart. For years, I had stood on the outside, peering through the keyhole, too afraid to knock. And all it took was for him to show up, lost and seeking shelter, for me to finally find the courage to simply let him in. We began to heal then, not just from his breakup or my years of solitude, but we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned, at long last, to create together. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of us.